we have now started module 3 of the course, which is essentially about the political economy that Marx elaborates upon. He explains how capitalism basically functions. So in this part of the course, we're really just looking at the economic theory of Karl Marx. And what we want to try and understand is the theory of surplus value. Probably one of the earliest works that Marx wrote, although there are notes, etc., economic and philosophic manuscripts and so on that are earlier than this as well, is this work, Wage, Labor and Capital, written in 1847, around the same time that Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. And you can very plainly see, if you compare this with Das Kapital, that in fact this is a far inferior work than Das Kapital, which is way, way, way more complicated, difficult, and more detailed and methodical. But this was written also as a popular outline. It was written deliberately to be as accessible as possible. It was written to be simple and so that workers could understand it, read it, and so on. It wasn't meant to be a deep analysis as such. And also, there was a big mistake in it. And that mistake was later fixed by Engels, which he writes in the introduction, which is what you were alluding to about what he adds, etc. But the way in which Engels edits it is the way that you see it today. It was re-edited in 1870s or whatever, and Engels says in the introduction that the way we are publishing it today is the way Marx would have written it were he to have written it after writing Das Kapital. So there is a big change in it. So we don't need to bother too much about that change, but we'll just keep this in mind that Marx's own ideas about political economy went through a major development before writing this and after writing Das Kapital, where he really plunges deeply into political economy to try and understand how capitalism essentially functions. So Marx begins by asking this central question: what are wages and how are they determined? Before I get into this first question, let me also lay down something else. If you know anything about Marxian economics, or the debate between Marxian economics and mainstream economics, I think you will know, or you must have heard, that Marx believes in the labor theory of value, and that classical economics and neoclassical economics and modern economics rejects the labor theory of value. So you ask a layman about Marxian economics, they'll often say, Marx didn't believe that prices were determined by demand and supply, because Marx believed that prices were determined by, the labor embodied in a commodity. And moreover, you may, amongst more sophisticated economists, also hear that Marx may or may not believe in the cost of production, whether that plays any role in the determination of price. In fact, the correct answer to your quiz and the correct answer here is that Marx never negated the theory of demand and supply. He never said that the cost of production theory is incorrect. He thought that labor theory of value, the idea of the cost of production and the idea of demand and supply, worked with each other quite seamlessly. So Marx never rejects the idea that the market determines prices through demand and supply. That's what we're going to discover here in Wage, Labor and Capital. Second thing that we're going to look out for in Wage, Labor and Capital is Marx explaining, number one, how the exploitation of the working class takes place. That is the rudimentary form of his theory of surplus value. Again, this is in very, very rudimentary form, extremely rudimentary. And secondly, his overall thesis, which is that as capitalism progresses, the antagonism, the social antagonism between the capitalist class and the working class will continue to increase. The inequality between them will increase. The social gap between them will continue to increase. The relative share of the social production, of the gross social production of any society, the relative share going to the workers will decrease, and the relative share going to the capitalist class will continue to increase. Hence, the social and political power of the capitalist class over the working class will continue to increase. So Marx begins by asking the central question, what are wages and how are they determined? In Das Kapital, he begins with a different question. He begins just with prices. He doesn't begin with wages. But here he begins with the price of a very important commodity within capitalism, which is the commodity that capitalists buy along with buying raw materials, machinery and other things in order to set production in motion, i.e. they employ people, so they pay a wage and hence they employ labor power. So this question that he begins with about wages and how they are determined really is meant to set the stage for us to understand how the workers are exploited and how the interests of the capitalist class and the working class are diametrically opposed to each other. He says it appears that the capitalist buys their labor with money. Nothing surprising about that. And that for money they sell him their labor. Now please note, it appears that they sell him, what do they sell him? Labor. But this is merely an illusion. What they actually sell to the capitalist for money is their labor power. So the first thing you need to recognize is that for Marx, there is a distinction between labor and labor power. It appears that the worker is selling what? Labor. But in reality, the worker is selling labor power. Labor, of course, is the work that workers do. Labor power is a commodity and it represents the capacity to do work. Not the work itself, but the capacity to do work for a certain unit of time. The two things are not only different, but the difference is the key discovery of Karl Marx. It's the most important aspect that Marx elucidates upon, and it is what distinguishes him, his understanding, from the understanding of Adam Smith and Ricardo and several other classical economists. Labor power is a commodity no more, no less than is the sugar. The first is measured by the clock, the other by the scales. Sugar is measured how? You put it on the scale, you put weight on the other side, that's how you measure sugar. How do you measure labor power? When you buy labor power, how do you measure what you have bought? You measure it with time. In other words, what you buy is time. You buy somebody else's time. You say, Taimur, I'm going to pay you X amount of money. I want you to give me this amount of time and come and teach at Lums. That's what I'm being paid for. I'm being paid to spend time over here. The worker has exchanged his commodity. What was my commodity? Labor power, for commodities of all kinds. So once I get that money for giving my time to the institution where I'm working, what do I do with that money? I go and buy the things that I need. In other words, food, clothing, petrol, send my kids to school, all of those things. The exchange value of a commodity estimates in money is called its price. So exchange value और price में क्या फर्क है? Exchange value is the relationship of two commodities to each other. For example, a pen and a pencil. Maybe two pencils would be equal to one pen. So what is the exchange value? Two pencils equal to one pen. It's in relative terms to each other. Okay? But what is price? How is that different? Price is in relation only to one kind of commodity called the money commodity. So price is the exchange value in terms of the money commodity. The money commodity means something like gold or silver. After a certain time of capitalist evolution, the money commodity just becomes money. It's no longer a commodity in the sense that there was a time when we used to trade with gold and silver. And then we created this paper money which represented gold and silver. It was not itself gold and silver. What is being exchanged now is not actually gold and silver, not a commodity, but just a value which is being exchanged. And now I can even transfer that with my phone or with a credit card, etc., not really exchanging anything at all, just saying I have given you this exchange value, right? So the value of any commodity, or rather more accurately, the exchange value of any commodity expressed in terms of money is price. Simple. Now, labor power is a commodity which its possessor, the wage worker, seen here, sells to the capitalist. Why does he sell it? It is obviously in order to live. The wage worker, this person over here, she has no means of production. She has no land, she has no property, she has no capital as such. She has to sell her time to the people who have those things. And that's what she does. So, why? Because the money that she will get, she will then be able to buy food and clothing for her child who is down here. His life activity, therefore, or her life activity, therefore, is but a means of securing her own existence. She works that she may keep alive. That's the purpose of work. And that's the case for the vast majority of people. If you do not find employment, you will starve. That's how the capitalist system works. Life for him, therefore, or her, begins where this life ceases, at the table, at the tavern, in bed, at home, with the children, and so on. Because this is a part of your life that has been bought by someone else. What you give, Marx says, when you go and say, please employ me, is your time, the most precious thing that you have, a part of your life. What you're giving to someone else is what? Your life activity, he calls it. You're giving a portion of your life, the limited time that you have on this earth. Maybe you live for 75 years. Well, given the smog, you'll probably live for 69 years. But if you live for, let's say, 70 years, and half that time you'll be sleeping and doing, sort of waking up and taking a bath and doing those things, that's like 35 years you really have. Out of those 35 years, you've already spent, at least 16 odd years in school, college, etc. So what do you get left with? You get left with about 15 actual years. And that time you are going to give, out of that time, you're going to give the vast majority of it to someone else. 8 hours a day is going to belong to not to you, but to somebody else. You'll be left with 4 hours a day, more or less, to spend with your kids. Imagine that. So what you end up with in terms of the actual time, if you put it all together with your doing what you want to do, is just like maybe 4 or 5 years or so. Shocking, I know. Labor was not always wage labor. It was not always the case that people went about asking to be employed. There was a time, for example, when workers were slaves. Slaves are just bought just like you go to a market and you buy an animal. That's it. Like you buy an ox, you buy a donkey, you buy a horse or whatever. That's how slaves were bought. Once a slave is bought, the slave, their time, not only their time, but their very bodies, their very personhood belongs to the master. Just as a dog or a hen or a chicken or whatever belongs to me, I can decide if I want to eat the chicken, I can zibah karify the chicken and eat the chicken. A slave is the same in the sense that wholly, completely, not just their time, but their selves as a whole belong to the master. He can do with them whatever he wants. Then there are also serfs. Serfs, he says, are kind of slaves, but kind of different as well. They are bound and tied to the land. That is the form of their slavery, that they are bound to the land. They can't go away from the land to which they are bound. They can't run away and go wherever they want. They work that land, and from the work they do, they transfer a portion of the work they do to the landlord in exchange for, quote-unquote, protection and so on and so forth, because they are the vassals and he is the lord. He is the owner of the land to which the serf is bound. And the serf, therefore, transfers a portion of their labor. Again, at the political and juridical level, the serf is never equal to the master, although to the lord. The serf has certain rights, that is true, but they are not equal rights to the lord. If a lord is killed, that is very, very serious. If a serf is killed, they can be recompensed with a little bit of money. Although when we ask whether the condition of slaves is better than the condition of serfs, and if that is better than the condition of wage workers, we are not talking about condition in terms of the absolute living standards of these people. it can be the case that when industrialization occurred, and it was the case, that when industrialization occurred, the urban proletariats were much worse off than the rural serfs, and then were even the slaves, Engels writes. But he considers the proletariat to be, despite in terms of absolute living standard, to be below the slave, but actually in terms of the evolution of society to be above the slave. How is he above the slave? Because he is considered in society a complete human being. He has equal rights in society, even to his employer as a human being, although his economic rights are not the same. But political rights do become equal in a republic. So it is a superior form where he is more empowered and enfranchised than was the case in the past, even though his real conditions may have sunk below. It's a tricky situation. It's not a one-dimensional answer. But the fact that they have become established as citizens is itself a major advance. As free citizens is itself considered by Marx and Engels to be a major advance. It means they're not an animal anymore. It means they can't be bought and sold. It means मेरा जिस्म मेरी मर्जी. वो अलग बात है कि you can't do anything because poverty is so bad that you have to find employment, etc. So you don't actually get to exercise that right. But the right does belong to you by legally speaking. So the free laborer, Marx says, auctions off 8, 10, 12, 15 hours of his life, one day like the next, to the highest bidder. What does the serf do? The serf is tied to the land. What does the slave do? Poor guy or woman is just set up over there and gets bought, etc., and that's it. But what does the worker do? The worker has to find his employer. He has to say, I am ready to work for you for this amount of time. And so the question is, how is the price of this person determined? This leads us to the question of prices overall. How are they determined? In order to find out how is the price of this woman determined, the labor time of this woman, how is it determined? How much money would she get for doing all this incredible work that she's doing? We would have to know how are the prices of all commodities determined. So Marx answers, competition between buyers and sellers by the relation of the demand to the supply. He says political economy is already answered that that is how prices are determined. And they're not wrong. That is how prices are determined. He's not saying short run, long run. All the time, that is how they're determined. If there are too many sellers and too few buyers, the competition between the sellers is too much. So what happens is that they are forced to reduce their price. If there are too many buyers, the competition between the buyers is too much, and there are too few sellers, so then the price can go up. And there is, of course, all the time competition between buyers and sellers, because sellers want to sell as high as possible, and buyers want to buy as cheap as possible. So that's basically what's happening constantly in the market. In the market, there is just competition all the time between buyers, between sellers, and between buyers and sellers. And now with Alfred Marshall, of course, we put that on the graph with demand and supply and so on. But Marx doesn't bother with all of that. He doesn't put it on a graph. The main reason why I think that this approach and that approach is different is because the graph basically takes one aspect of what causes quantity demanded, just one aspect, and separates it from all the others. And it takes one aspect of what determines supply and separates it from all others. That aspect, of course, is the variation that was going to occur in the quantity demanded as a consequence, or quantity supplied as a consequence of price. All the other factors that move the overall demand and supply are just put in a separate category, which is why you get this idea, which is taught in Economics 101, that quantity demanded is something different from demand, although they both sound exactly the same, right? So Marx doesn't go into that whole division, etc. He just says demand can go up for any reason, and any number of reasons. It can go up just because you saw Michael Jackson wearing that glove and you're like, I want that glove. Doesn't matter. It can go up because you think you're going to get more healthy. It can go up because you have more money. Any reason that it goes up, where demand goes up, price will go up. And any reason that supply goes up, where it goes up, price will fall. It's just that simple, okay? Much simpler, in fact. Now, if price is determined by the relation of supply and demand, note, he's not saying that's not the case. He's saying that is the case. By what is the relation of supply and demand determined? It just begs the question. If price is determined by supply and demand, I want to know how is supply and demand determined? He says supply and demand are determined by the cost of production. Okay. When price is higher than the cost of production, a mass of capital will be thrown into the prosperous branch of industry, and this immigration of capital into the provinces of the favored industry will continue until it yields no more than the customary profits, or rather until the price of its products, owing to overproduction, sinks below the cost of production. What is he saying? He is saying exactly the same thing that you study with Marshall and that you study in Introduction to Economics. Whenever the price of something, owing to a lot of demand, goes high, that's not where the story ends. When the price goes up, it goes high, the manufacturers, the suppliers say, oh my God, there's profit to be made here. So what do? Capital goes into that branch of industry. People start to move capital. Let's say, give you an example, an easy example. Let's say the prices of shoes goes up because shoes are in demand, or blue shoes are in demand because somebody saw me wear them and like, I want to have the same shoes as Dr. Taimur Rahman. Okay, so the prices of blue shoes goes up. What's going to happen next? Now you're just going to stop there and say, oh look, demand has pushed it up. But what Marx points out is, and what of course Adam Smith pointed out, this is not Marx's original theory, this is Smith's theory, and he's not wrong. Every economist accepts this, is that once the price of the shoe goes up, other shoe manufacturers who are making pink shoes or red shoes or black shoes, they're going to say, listen, the prices of blue shoes are going up, let's make blue shoes. Let's make less pink shoes, let's make more blue shoes. So they start making more blue shoes. And when they start making more blue shoes, supply goes up, and as supply goes up, the price comes back down. The opposite happens if the supply falls below a certain average, which is the cost of production. If it goes too low, then the opposite thing happens. Capitalists say, nobody's buying blue shoes anymore. Let's stop production. Let's stop supply of these things, and prices then start to rise back up. In other words, demand and supply move prices along a certain average. It was the task of classical political economy to try and understand what is that point around which the prices fluctuate. Prices are not free to fluctuate and go wherever the hell they want to. That's not how economics works. No economist has said that prices can go wherever the hell they want to. Obviously, that's not possible. The price of bread has never risen above the price of a Boeing 747, right? So what is it that pushes the price of the bread back down? And what is it that keeps the price of the Boeing 747 up so high? He says it is the cost of production, that demand and supply will move capital in and out. When demand and supply raise or lower the price, capital will move in or move out respectively, lowering the price or raising the price once again. So, the fluctuation of supply and demand always bring the price of a commodity back to its cost of production. This again is not something unique to Marx. In his own time, political economy has already come to this conclusion, that prices move around the cost of production. So the fluctuation of supply and demand always brings the price of a commodity back to its cost of production. And these fluctuations that occur, he says, are part of the system. They're not a defect in capitalism. That's how capitalism functions. He says it is precisely these fluctuations that force the price to conform to the cost of production. In the totality of this disorderly movement is to be found its order. In the total course of this industrial anarchy, in this circular movement, competition balances, as it were, the one extravagance by the other. If it goes too high, it'll go the other way and it'll push it down. If it goes too low, it'll go the other way and it'll push it back up. Okay, so these fluctuations of the prices owing to supply and demand are very much part and parcel of the capitalist system. That's how the system functions. It's never exactly at the cost of production, but the further it moves from the cost of production, the more there is pressure on it to go back to that particular point. It's like an elastic band, but the elastic band is never steady there. It's always moving, and that's just how the system works. So now Marx points out that the cost of production is determined by the labor time embodied in the commodity. Here's the third part of the quiz. He's saying cost of production is equal to what? The labor overall embodied in the commodity. He writes, the determination of price by cost of production is tantamount to the determination of price by the labor time requisite to the production of a commodity, for the cost of production consists first of raw materials and wear and tear of tools, etc., of industrial products whose production has cost a certain number of work days, which therefore represent a certain amount of labor time, and secondly of direct labor, which is also measured by its duration. In other words, all the things that go into the cost of making something can be broken down into the cost of labor, the labor embodied in them. So if you're a capitalist and you undertake production, what do you need for that? Firstly, you need laborers. Secondly, you need raw materials. Thirdly, you probably need machines. Fourthly, you need a place to work, all of those things. The machines were also created by labor. The place to work, the building, etc., created by labor. Labor is labor. The raw materials was also gotten from the earth by labor. Everything is reconciled into labor time. This again is not unique to Marx. This is something already done by David Ricardo. David Ricardo already points out that the cost of production is reconcilable only in terms of labor, although Ricardo made a small mistake there, which Marx later fixes. So back to the question that we began with, by what are wages determined? Wages are also firstly determined by demand and supply, just like any other commodity. And secondly, just like any other commodity, wages are determined by the cost of production, okay, just like we said before. But the cost of production of labor, how would we find out the cost of production of labor? It is labor that creates labor. Cost of production of labor kya hoga phir? This is where classical political economy got stuck. This is where Ricardo got stuck. This is where Smith could not answer this question. In the mid-19th century, this is the point at which classical political economy basically could not explain how is the cost of production of a laborer to be determined. That would be, what is the labor necessary to create labor? It just kind of doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So this is what Marx explained. It is not the cost of production of the laborer. It is not the cost of production of labor, that is totally wrong. It is the cost of production of labor time, the time that you bought. What does it cost to produce that time? That is the cost of production, that is what you pay for in wages. It is the time that I pay for as a capitalist. What does it cost to produce that time? So that's why he writes, demand and supply will bring wages to the cost of production of not labor, not the laborer, but labor power. Previously, as I've written over here, political economy stated demand and supply will bring wages equal to the cost of production of labor. But if that is the case, then political economy cannot explain surplus value, and that's why Ricardo also got stuck with the 93% labor theory of value. So what is the cost of production of labor power, the time that I have bought? I haven't bought the person lock, stock and barrel as I would buy a slave. They're not bound, I've employed them, and in the employment contract I have said I want your time. What does it cost to produce that time? Well, first of all, obviously it's going to be subsistence. He has to live, he has to eat, he has to, or she has to eat and live. Secondly, it would be the cost of propagation. Just like a machine has wear and tear, and the cost of the machine includes the cost of wear and tear when you use it, in much the same way, the cost of a laborer, the cost of production of labor time includes the wear and tear of the laborer in that time. So it is the cost of production of propagation. And the third, which he adds later in Das Kapital, but not here in Wage, Labor and Capital, is also the cost of training and education of that labor power. It will be included in the cost of production of that person. So when you are sitting here at Lunds, what is happening is somebody is paying the cost for the production of the quality of labor that you can perform. That means your labor power is become skilled labor power, hence it is more expensive. So actual wages, as we've already explained, may fluctuate around this cost of production. Just like actual prices fluctuate around the cost of production of a commodity. They're not equal to that. They're always going above it and below it. They may go so below it that you may offer starvation wages. right? On the basis of which nobody is going to work because you're not even going to meet means of subsistence or cost of propagation. If you don't make means of subsistence, if I say to somebody, do 1 month of labor for me and I'll pay you 10 rupees, that person is not going to have enough money to feed himself for the next day, even that day. He won't appear the next day because he'll be dead, because he'll starve to death. So it cannot go beyond a certain level. If it goes beyond a certain level, what happens? The laborer is unable to reproduce, and that's why the market is unable to clear if it goes too far low. Now, the nature of growth of capital is such that capital consists, as we know, people inform us, of raw materials, instruments of labor, means of subsistence of all kinds. These, all of them, are created by labor. Hence, capital is accumulated labor. If you are a manufacturer, when you ask a manufacturer, what is your capital? What does he point to? He says, you know, I bought this raw material, that's my capital. He says, I bought this machinery, that's my capital. I built this building, that's part of my capital. This is what I've invested in. And what's the other part? The other part is the money I give to the workers, etc., the salaries and wages, etc., I give. So when he points to those different things and says, these are my capital, in fact, economics even makes the mistake of saying that machinery is capital. You see? Because machinery used to be the most expensive part of what a manufacturer had to buy. So they call it capital. A banker will always say the first money you invest is capital. They always use this term. But these terms are not what Marx means. Because capital can be any value that is being used, Marx says, to increase value. Any exchange value used to increase value is basically capital. Capital is that which is used in a particular way. The way in which capital becomes capital is that money, or forget about money, is that exchange value which is used to create profit. That's when it becomes capital. If it's not creating profit, it's not capital. So what is profit? It is accumulation. It is gathering. It is growing. It is valorization, as Marx puts it in Das Kapital. Hence, capital is accumulated labor that serves as a means of new production. When a capitalist points to that, what is he pointing to? Accumulated labor. But capital, therefore, is not just the machines. It's not just the land or raw materials. It's something else. He says it is a social relation. In order that accumulated labor can serve as a means to augment production, in other words, to augment it, to increase it, certain social relations have to be created. Capital, therefore, is a social relation of production, of the capitalist mode of production. Capital is a social relation. Oh my God, it's not neither a machine, nor is it the money, nor is it this. In fact, it's a relationship between people. A particular kind of relationship between people creates the thing that we call capital in economics. Capital is that which multiplies by exchanging with living labor. Capital is that which augments itself, self-valorizes, increases in value. That's capital. Hence, the existence of a class which possesses nothing but the ability to work is a necessary presupposition of capital. Capital does not exist here. There's no self-valorization process going on over here. Capital exists only in the capitalist mode of production. That process of self-valorization. What's happening here is that these people are producing whatever they're producing, and then they give it to this guy, and they eat what they need to eat. It doesn't even take the commodity form. It doesn't even become a commodity. It's not even turned into exchange value. It doesn't even go on the market. The only thing that goes into the market is this guy who's running around to the city and getting the luxury goods. So capital only comes into existence when this system finishes and you get this new system of wage labor. Wage labor and capital are the same relationship expressed or looked at from different perspectives. Capital consists in the fact that living labor serves accumulated labor as a means of preserving and multiplying its exchange value. The role of labor now becomes to accumulate value, to develop capital, to grow that exchange value. That's the actual function of the wage laborer. And this is what sets up the relationship between the personification of capital, who is the capitalist, and the personification of wage laborer, who is the wage laborer. Wage labor, who is the wage laborer. The laborer receives means of subsistence in exchange for his labor power. The capitalist receives in exchange for his means of subsistence labor, the productive activity of the laborer. What does the laborer receive? Means of subsistence in exchange for what? Labor power. But what does the capitalist receive? The capitalist in exchange for his means of subsistence receives not labor power, but labor, the productive activity of the laborer. This is where the game changes. He gives an example. For 1 shilling, a laborer works all day long in the fields of a farmer, to whom he thus secures a return of 2 shillings. He takes 1 shilling, he works for the day, and after the day is done, the work he has done and the product he creates becomes 2 shillings. The 1 shilling has therefore been consumed in a double manner. Reproductively for the capitalist advanced 1 shilling and now it's become 2 shillings. For it has been exchanged for labor power, which brought forth 2 shillings. Unproductively for the worker, for it has been exchanged for means of subsistence, which are lost forever, and whose value he can obtain again only by repeating the same exchange with the farmer. So in other words, he has taken the 1 shilling and with it bought food, fed himself. This is unproductive use. He is majboor, he has to use it unproductively, in the sense that it's not valorized, it's not grown. Capital therefore presupposes wage labor presupposes capital, they condition each other, each brings the other into existence. Now, capitalists say, well, that's okay, so yeah, what's a big deal? What if wages grow? This is one of my favorite passages, because whenever you talk about capitalism, a pro-capitalist person will always say, yes, there's capitalism, there's inequality, but look, the conditions of workers are getting better. What does Marx say about that? He says, a house may be large or small. As long as the neighboring houses are likewise small, it satisfies all social requirements for a residence. But let there arise next to the little house a palace, and the little house shrinks to a hut. The little house now makes it clear that its inmate has no social position at all to maintain, or but a very insignificant one. And however high it may shoot up in the course of civilization, if the neighboring palace rises in equal or even in greater measure, the occupant of the relatively little house will always find himself more uncomfortable, more dissatisfied, more cramped within his 4 walls. The absolute condition of the worker may be getting better, but the relative condition of the worker is getting worse. And because we look around ourselves in society and we see how other people are living, what we consider to be comfortable living also changes. Not in relation to what we had before, but also in relation to what others have around us. You today have a telephone which can do wonders. That old dumb phone, the Nokia ka phone hota hai, purana wala, Ericsson ka, Sony Ericsson phone, that did not have any smart screen on it, etc. When we first got it, we thought, oh my God, this is the best thing one could have ever had. Because nobody had that at the time. Today, if I give that to somebody, they'll say, they'll throw it away as junk. Even though they may not have a phone, but they'll say, no, if you want to give me a phone, give me a smartphone. That's the new standard now. So in that sense, you see that our needs are social. We judge things not just by looking at what did I have yesterday versus what I have today, but we also look at what does my neighbor have, what does society have, and so on. So what becomes important, therefore, is not just the absolute share, but the relative share for workers, for people. An appreciable rise in wages presupposes a rapid growth of productive capital. Let's say capitalism develops very quickly. There's a big growth of capital. The rapid growth of productive capital calls forth just as rapid a growth of wealth, of luxury, of social needs and social pleasures. Therefore, although the pleasures of the laborer have increased, the social gratification which they afford has fallen in comparison with the increased pleasures of the capitalist, which are inaccessible to the worker, in comparison with the stage of development of society in general. Our wants and pleasures have their origin in society. We therefore measure them in relation to society. We do not measure them in relation to the objects which serve for their gratification. Since they are of a social nature, they are of a relative nature. In other words, you may be better off than you were before. The worker today is definitely better off than the serfs of older times, than the worker of the 19th century. The worker today is better off than kings of the past. But do they feel better off? Do they feel like a king? No, absolutely not. Kings of the past had, as I told you, had to send people on horseback to faraway mountains to get ice, which they would bring back in a box, and then the king would drink it and say, ah, that was amazing. Because they didn't have fridges. But today, a worker may have ice in the fridge, but may feel it's not a very big deal. Why? Because everybody has that. That's not extraordinary anymore. You may be better off than the king of the past. But if you look at what is the general level of society, you may feel, what's the big deal if I have a little bit of ice? That's not the main problem. The main problem is, I can't send my kids to a good school. What if you're sending them to school? Your parents didn't send them to a school. But still you're looking at all the other people and what kind of schools they are going to. They're going to Beacon House and Lums, etc. And you're going to the slums. You're not going to be happy with that. So here Marx brings about the distinction between nominal wages, real wages, and the most important thing, relative wages. Nominal wages are easy to understand. It just basically means the money you get in terms of the number. So if my wage is 30,000 rupees and tomorrow it becomes 40,000 rupees, my nominal wage has gone up by 10,000 rupees. Simple. But real wages are, of course, what I can buy with that. If inflation has gone up by a lot more, then my nominal wage may have gone up, but the stuff that I can buy with 30,000 rupees is probably more than the stuff I can buy with 40,000 rupees after inflation. That means my real wage has gone down. That means the actual number of things that I can buy has gone down. So real wages express the price of labor power in relation to the prices of commodities, what I can buy with that thing, in that wage. Relative wages, on the other hand, express the share of the immediate labor in the value newly created by it in relation to the share of it which falls to the accumulated labor, that is, to capital. Relative wages is more important because it's in relation to what has been produced. This is nominal wages do not coincide with real wages. Then real wages do not coincide with relative wages. Okay? What are relative wages? Relative wages are wages in relation to profits. Nominal wages are wages in relation to money. Real wages are wages in relation to commodities. Relative wages are wages in relation to overall production, which will include, obviously, profits. He says that's the most important thing you have to understand. Relative wages, on the other hand, express the share of immediate labor in the value newly created by it in relation to the share of it which falls to accumulated labor, that is, to capital. In other words, relative wages measure of the overall gross total production done by society, what share do the workers get and what share do the capitalists get from the overall pie? As is my hissa of the overall pie shrinking, or is it growing? That's what relative wages measure. Economists never talk about this, except for Marxists. They don't talk about it. But this is the key thing. They only talk about it very indirectly when they talk about Gini coefficient inequality. They don't link it to wages and profit directly in this way, the way in which Marx is linking it. And this is the big kicker. Relative wages are always falling in capitalism. The share of the pie that goes to the workers is always decreasing as time goes on, as capitalism develops. The share going to the capitalists is increasing and increasing and increasing, which is why global inequality is increasing. Marx has explained to you why it is the case that 6 people have more money than half the planet, because relative wages are declining. He says real wages may remain the same, they may even rise, nevertheless the relative wages may fall. As capital advances, the share of capitals in proportion to the share of labor has risen. The distribution of social wealth between capital and labor has become still more unequal. The capitalist commands a greater amount of labor with the same capital. The power of the capitalist class over the working class has grown. The social position of the worker has become worse, has been forced down still another degree below that of the capitalist. This is even in the best conditions of capitalist production. When real wages are going up, he's saying your relative wages are going down. Your share in overall society is going down. Your social position in overall society is going down. That's what's going on with capitalism. Wages and profit therefore stand in inverse proportion to each other. The share of profit increases in the same proportion in which the share of labor, that is wages, falls, and vice versa. When we look at the price of something, we can divide it into these three parts. First is the replacement of the price for raw materials, wear and tear of the tools, machines, and other instruments of labor. Secondly is the replacement by the wages. And thirdly is the profit. Okay? This is the cost of the accounting cost of the capitalist. You add this, you get the profit. This is the profit. How does this work? This is the secret and the origin of surplus value. If the sale price is the same as the cost of production, where does the surplus value profit come from? If I bought everything at its cost and I've sold it at its cost, how do I get a profit? This is what Marx answers. He says surplus value is equal to the sale price minus the wages, minus the raw materials, minus the depreciation. So where does surplus value come from? It comes from here. It doesn't come from raw materials. You paid for the labor in the raw materials. You paid for the depreciation in the raw materials. Where then does the surplus value come from? It comes from the difference between labor and labor power. Because what the capitalist pays for is labor power, which is the cost it takes to produce you. But what the capitalist gets by paying for that time is the labor that you give him. And the labor that you give in that time is much higher than the labor power it takes to buy that time. That is the essential difference. When I pay you, I pay the cost it takes to produce you for that amount of time. But in that time, how much do you produce? You produce more than it costs to produce you in that time. Where does the difference between that go? It goes into my pocket as profit. That is the basis of surplus value. You could call it unpaid labor, but it works within the system because every commodity is paid the amount of labor embodied in it. The commodity that is being bought is labor power. The product you create is your labor within that time. The labor you do is above the labor power. The cost of your production is higher than your production. You can produce more than it costs to produce you. If it costs 10,000 rupees to produce you for 1 hour, you can produce in 1 hour goods worth 20,000 rupees. I'm going to pay you 10,000 rupees because I'm going to pay you according to the same law as all commodities. But what I'm going to get in return is not labor power. I'm going to set labor power into motion. And then I get accumulated labor. That time I got from you. In that time you work. When you work, you produce commodities worth much more than you are worth. So if LUMS pays me X amount, in that time frame, if LUMS was a for-profit institution, which it is not, or at least it claims not to be, in that time, the value I produce for LUMS is higher than the value LUMS is paying me. Because LUMS is paying me for what it costs to produce me. But what I produce is much higher than what it costs to produce me. The difference between the two is surplus value. So profits can grow rapidly only when the price of labor, the relative wages decrease just as rapidly. Profits grow when relative wages decline. If therefore the income of the worker increased with the rapid growth of capital, there is at the same time a widening of the social chasm that divides the worker from the capitalist, an increase in the power of capital over labor, a greater dependence of labor upon capital. As capitalism progresses, your relative share is going down, theirs is going up. So profit and wages are in inverse proportion. They're always opposite to each other. If capital grows, wages may rise, yani ki real wages may rise. But the profit of capitalists rises disproportionately faster. And so relative wages decline. The material position of the worker has improved, but at the cost of his social position. Now he is better off materially, but socially he is not better off. The social chasm that separates him from the capitalist, therefore, has widened. This is what generates the class struggle. No matter how powerful the means of production which a capitalist may bring into the field, competition will always make their adaptation general. I bring in new machinery, my competitor will also do the same thing. And so in this way, through competition, every capitalist is bringing in the new machinery, etc. Every time I bring a new machinery, I have a slight advantage over the market. But once my competition brings in the machinery, I lose that advantage. And in this way, through competition, capitalism progresses rapidly. Rapidly to develop the division of labor, and through the division of labor, the social chasm between the workers and the capitalists increases also rapidly. Thus, the capitalist will have gained nothing more by his efforts than the obligation to furnish a greater product in the same labor time. In a word, more difficult conditions for the profitable employment of his capital. Competition constantly pursues him with its law of cost of production and turns against himself every weapon that he forges against his rivals. I think of my mother, who is a capitalist, who is a great designer, and she makes furniture, wonderful, beautiful furniture. And when she started making this new kind of furniture, which was very ethnic, etc., because very Pakistani, Multani, all of those things. She's not from Multan. It's just that she loves craft, so she went all over the Punjab and got the best craftsmen together and did wonderful stuff. And she created this new line of furniture, which was a huge hit in the 1980s. And she made tons and tons of money back then. And then pretty soon, the whole of Lahore copied her designs. Everybody started doing the same thing, and her profits went back down. So this happens in every business, unless, of course, there are barriers to entry or exit. It happens in every business. And as this happens and as this grows, the work becomes even more unsatisfactory, and the worker becomes cheaper and cheaper. The greater division of labor enables one laborer to accomplish the work of 5, 10, or 20 laborers. It therefore increases competition among the workers, 5-fold, 10-fold, or 20-fold. As new machinery is introduced, the competition between workers increases. Their wages go down. To the same degree in which the division of labor increases is the labor simplified. So when machinery is introduced, deskilling ho jati hai. The special skill of the laborer becomes worthless. He becomes transformed into a simple monotonous force of production with neither physical nor mental elasticity. He's just doing a repetitive task. Tuck, 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 tuck. Come in, teach, go home, check papers. Therefore, in the same manner in which labor becomes more unsatisfactory, more repulsive, do competition increase and wages decrease. At the same time that you are being paid relatively less and less, absolute terms you might be paid more, but relatively you're paid less and less. At the same time, you're doing more and more boring things. That's what happens for the vast majority of people in capitalism. So the more he works, the less wages he receives. Relative wages. And for the simple reason, the more he works, the more he competes against his fellow workmen, the more he compels them to compete against himself and to offer themselves on the same wretched conditions as he does, so that in the last analysis he competes against himself as a member of the working class. And what is true for the working class is also true for third world countries. We are also competing with each other to offer the worst labor conditions. Acha, Bangladesh, they'll do it for this much, we'll do it for even less. Bangladesh, they don't have these environmental laws, they have these environmental laws, forget them, we already have enough smog, we'll have a little more, no problem. Come and invest here. We're competing with each other constantly. We are the proletarians of the international political economy, the third world. The dead bury the dead. Machinery throws workers upon the streets in great masses, the question you asked, in periods of depression. And as it becomes more highly developed and more productive, it discards them in additional, those smaller numbers. In capitalism, the battles are won less by recruiting than by discharging the army of workers. The less workers I need, the more advanced capitalism is. I discharge workers, it means I'm growing, because I'm using more machines rather than workers. The generals, the capitalists, vie with one another as to who can discharge the greatest number of industrial soldiers. That's the war that's going on. Capitalists say, oh, but don't worry, yes, we fired them, but they'll find better work. But that's not true. How could a mass of workers thrown out of one branch of industry by machinery find refuge in another branch unless they were to be paid more poorly? Yes, they'll find work in some other place, but they may or may not find work in some other place. But they're not going to get the same wage because you're creating unemployment. The most diverse machines are now applied to the manufacture of machines themselves. So machines are making machines, 3D printers, so you don't need workers to do that either. To sum up, the more productive capital grows, the more it extends the division of labor and the application of machinery. The more the division of labor and the application of machinery extend, the more does competition extend amongst the workers, the more do their wages shrink together. As capitalism develops, satyanas kar deta hai logon ka. And to end, he says beautifully, this is such a gorgeous phrase, he says, the forest of outstretched arms begging for work grows ever thicker while the arms themselves grow ever leaner. Capital not only lives upon labor, like a master at once distinguished and barbarous, it drags with it into its grave the corpses of its slaves, whole hecatombs of workers who perish in the crisis.